this is Game 8 of the 2021 FIDE World Chess Championship. And as Robert just said, this was another Petrov, a choice from the world champion, predicted on the board by Fabiano Caruana here in the studio, as not just a Petrov, but the exact line with bishop d3 and d5, and knight takes e5. Now here when Jan played knight d7, this is when we had our first, not necessarily surprise, right? You highlighted the main line, including the game between Bishi Anand and Wang Hao from the 2019 FIDE Grand Swiss that occurs with knight to c3. But instead, Fabi, we had knight takes d7, and then the actual first surprise, this interesting move, knight d2.
Yeah, this is a rare move, and we pointed out the reason for it is because if white castles first, and after bishop d6, knight to d2, if Magnus were to try the same approach, black is not forced to take on d2, transposing into the game, but can castle using the tactic available to him, which is bishop takes h2 if white captures on e4. And here black would equalize very easily.
Yep. Because
regaining the piece and staying equal material with an equal position. So Magnus had a tricky little idea up his sleeve. It's, again, typical Magnus to have some small try, which, on paper, it looks like black equalizes comfortably, but he understands that there's some small problems to solve. And as Robert mentioned, he was in a good position in the match, up one game. So he could afford to play a slightly more quiet and solid line, taking no risks, because we understood white risks nothing in this type of position, but still keeping some slight pressure on Jan.
And in this position here after castles, you mentioned no real risk, but some slight pressure. There were so many lines we were looking at that really showed how tricky this position is for black. Ultimately, Jan actually took a lot of time here before the move he uncorked. But remind us, Robert, of just the critical reasons why simple moves like castles could have been hard for black.
Yeah, this game is a great demonstration of first move advantage.
Yeah.
Because after castling, we have the same exact position for both sides, but white gets to strike first with queen to h5, threatening queen takes h7 checkmate, threatening queen takes d5, and if black is forced to play f5, you have made a huge concession. The e5 square, potentially the e6 square, and the e file, white is first to that because the rooks are connected. So that's why Jan decided not to play castles kingside, play the adventurous h5, but it was the follow-up after this that really caught us off guard.
Yeah, Magnus, in turn, spent a lot of time thinking here, which was interesting, right? Because Magnus uncorks knight d2. Jan takes a whole lot of time to play h5. Magnus really stops to think. I think in hindsight, we can say it was because he might have already been sensing, okay, this is an opportunity here, right? I'm going to get something dynamic enough to push for. And he plays not the obvious rook e1 check, which maybe has a little something, not even a more logical move like queen f3 that we were looking at, but a move we hadn't really talked about except for really briefly. This move, queen e1 check, was played to ask the question to the king, but also to create this interesting threat of transitioning into a position where the dark square bishops come off the board in a huge way for white.
Yeah, h5 was a fascinating move. I feel like it was the result of knowledge of the position. I think that Jan knew something about this line.
Yeah.
And because in hindsight, we know that h5 would have worked out quite fine for black. But after queen to e1, which I'm sure was a surprise for Jan, and a surprise for all of us, queen to e7, I think, would have been a fairly easy path to equality. And we were looking at the line where black's king runs up to f6, queen takes e7, king takes e7, rook a to e1, king to f6. The king is momentarily in some danger after h4, but then black would play bishop to f5, trading off more pieces, including the bishop, which is slightly worse than white's, and leading to, I think, a pretty much dead equal position.
Yeah.
If Jan had played queen e7, I don't think he would have encountered very serious problems. That's not to say that he would have necessarily held the game after that. He might still have been put under pressure later, but I don't think that he would have faced opening problems.
Well, perhaps even more illogical, though, was that not just that he played king f8, that move may be okay, but after bishop e4, he then played queen e7, right? So if you were going to do it, why not do it before?
It's the question that I think everyone wants the answer to. It didn't really make sense. And his position wasn't that bad even after this point. We saw that bishops get traded, but the issue is that rook on h8. You can lift up to h6, an idea that we were talking about during the game and eventually happened, but the problem is you can never quite bring his rook to e6, so that h5 pawn. Once pawns advance, they can't move back, and when your king is on that side of the board, if you lose that kind of pawn, your king's in really big danger. So the move h5 had its purposes, but now that rook couldn't quite get into the game.
Yeah, and queen g5 was the move that really highlights what you said, that the rook would love to come over here and challenge the e-file, but not so fast because of the pawn. The queen would love to come over and get this thorn out of his shoe, so to speak, but you got to worry about d5. And because of that, Jan played c6. But now, Robert, you highlighted a really critical point, which is that because this pawn comes to c6 to defend d5, the bishop actually suddenly has less scope. And that led to some forcing lines for Magnus. He played rook takes e8. Maybe there were other options, but immediately grabbing the e-file and trying to get aggressive over here because of the lack of activity that bishop now had.
Right, because rook e6 would be available.
Yep.
And if we just go through that line once more, rook takes e6, you can take with the pawn, but then you have a terrible structure.
Yep.
The queen on g5 is great, black's pawns can't move, so if you take with the queen, you lose h5, you get a single check on e1, and unfortunately in chess you can't play bishop to b5. You can't jump over your own pawn here, otherwise black would be winning, but because that pawn went to c6, Magnus realized he could capitalize on the moment and take over the e-file.
Yeah, and that's exactly the kind of moment that just is whatever you want to call it. Magnus Carlsen's calling card, the little things, right, that become big things. He's king of making the mountains out of molehills, if you will. Pawn on c6 led to this forcing line where black's problems were becoming even more clear. Queen f6 is now played because the pawn does defend d5, but after queen to e3 and bishop d7, you said again, Magnus knows when to change the position, and he did so here. And Jan, in hindsight, we know the next move was a big mistake. Should he have also tried to maintain this tension, or you feel like that was right on cue in terms of what black has to play?
I think that the move h3 is a bit underappreciated because this was actually one of the most impressive moves in the game, I thought.
Yeah.
It looks like white needs to do something very direct, but in fact I liked h3 just giving white's king some luft, and we saw a line after h3 if black plays queen to d6, trying to trade rooks via e6, queen to g5, queen to f6, trying to trade queens again, queen to g3, queen to d6, trying to trade queens for the third time. Now if white plays rook e5, black no longer has rook e6 as an option. If the pawn were on h2, black would have rook e6 with a good position. But here rook takes h5.
Because this would be met by this with a pawn on h2.
Yeah, now white's king has that square on h2 to go to. White's bishop is not forced into passivity, so it stays on d3, and white has a healthy extra pawn. So this was the point of h3, the reason why Jan couldn't immediately solve his issues and why he played a waiting move in return, h4, which is a perfectly good move. But now Magnus could say, well, my h3 pawn is more useful than your h4 pawn because I never have to worry about the back rank again. And then he hit in the center with c4. He sensed this was the moment to try to play concretely. Although this move likely doesn't lead to an advantage, it still gives black concrete problems to solve. And for some reason, Jan wasn't ready to start calculating lines.
Yep.
He correctly took. Maybe taking wasn't necessary, but we felt like taking on c4 was the correct decision for black. And it was at this moment that Jan chose a shocking move.
b5. The move that will be talked a lot about, again, because what are all the reasons? Well, obviously, objectively, it's not a good move, right? It lost the pawn, but it also arguably was not necessary, yet you had been holding well, Robert, for some time, right? And because of the nature in which it leads to forcing lines, you have to assume, okay, if you're forcing something, you better have calculated, but when you clearly didn't, it can only be described as a reckless move.
Something that Sergei Karyakin did so well in his World Championship match against Magnus is he didn't force the issue.
Yeah.
He was okay to be the one reacting to Magnus's plans, even though it meant he would not get activity of his own. He said, I'm solid enough, I'll be able to hold. b5 is going full steam ahead and the position doesn't call for it. Now your pawn on a7 was directly lost. And what my coach said growing up is mistakes often come in pairs in chess. And it was first b5, then after queen a3 check, king to g8, queen a7, queen d8 doesn't even put up a fight because the only resistance that could be had in the position was bishop takes h3. It's going to be a bad endgame. You're going to grovel for a draw, and maybe you won't make it. But queen d8 is just saying, I have no fight left in me. This is your game.
And for those who may be just tuning in, perhaps the line, there were many that might have been on the board in the game, could have been something like this, where black does have bishop f5, and while, again, objectively, white is up a pawn, and we did display in real time probably some of the better plans for white, perhaps starting with moves like rook e5 to try to convert. At the very least, this needs to be converted. This is going to take some work, and black's drawing chances are clear, only being down a pawn. But in the game, as Robert said, perhaps even more perplexing than b5 was the follow-up queen d8. and now you're just sitting in a position down a pawn, right? Here white has the pawn and the compensation, so to speak. Bishop b3, rook up to e4. And I'm gonna go forward. I don't know that there was anything better for Jan at this point. The pressure on f7 via the X-ray vision that the queen displays on the 7th rank forces a move like bishop e6.
Well, let's just show why Jan didn't make a waiting move like g6.
Okay.
In fact, there's probably more than one reason. Rook to f4 is probably winning on the spot. There's also rook takes h4 if we like cute little tactics.
We love cute little tactics around here.
Queen takes h4, queen to b8. White has picked up another pawn, and the rook is coming with it.
Yep.
So Jan was obligated to trade bishops. And although he wants to trade bishops, he doesn't want to trade bishops in this way, where he further damages his structure.
Right.
And in this position, we already saw the writing on the wall. It's not only that white is up a pawn, it's that black has too many weaknesses to hold. If he could try to defend everything while creating counterplay against white's king, maybe there would be some drawing chances. But he tried to create counterplay with queen a5, but he wasn't able to hold all his weaknesses.
Yeah. Goes for some checks, but Magnus now at this point was in whatever you want to call it, conversion mode, right? He had the focus of a predator, and he never let up from here on out. And I can go through these games. The centralized queen is obviously super instructive as a very important thing for everyone to take away. That's how you convert these endgames. The queen does the job of protecting against perpetuals as well as helping the pawns go forward. And really, Robert, you were just applauding Magnus's just discipline here, right? Leading by example, if you will, is what the world champion did. He made this look so easy.
Yeah, and he actually also changed his plans. Because sometimes we're stubborn as human beings, but also as chess players, where we come up with a plan and in the next few moves, he brought his queen to c3 when I was saying he could go queen d1. He goes queen c3, and then we see a couple moves played with check, the king comes back, he goes back to d3, and guess what? He goes back to d1. And it's important that you're willing to go back to a plan you could have played and realize that maybe this is what I should have done. And all of the moves, for the most part, would have been winning, but he made this as easy as possible on himself. So he took his time, he kept his composure, and then he was saying, I'm willing to change my mind and go for a plan that may objectively be best. So I think it was a great demonstration of how to play these games, especially if you're a newer chess player. You can think when you have an hour on your clock, and if you're winning, there's no need to rush.
Well said. And perhaps the last good example he set is that against any tenacious defender, at some point they will challenge you with a plan that at least looks crazy, even if it isn't as complicated as first seems. And he still kept his focus, taking with the h-pawn, allowing the wild-looking h3. Again, note that taking with the queen to keep your king side looking pretty could actually be a huge blunder due to ideas like queen e1 check and queen e5. So really good example again. You have to calculate in the end because a good defender will make you do so, and he did just that with queen f3. You realize it was all just smoke and mirrors, despite how scary this kind of looks, and Jan, in fact, resigned. Chess.com's coverage of the 2021 FIDE World Championship is brought to you by our partners at Coinbase. Whether you're just thinking about making your first crypto purchase, just wanting to learn a little bit more about the crypto industry, or if you've been doing this thing for years and you're an experienced trader, Coinbase is the place to be. Visit coinbase.com/chess and get $5 in free Bitcoin just for signing up and verifying your account today. We really encourage you to do so. Go check them out at coinbase.com.